Welcome to the Tech Talk by Microsoft EMEA. My name is Manfred Helber. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, and this is your hour for your questions around the Microsoft systems, around the Microsoft technologies. So if you have any questions, feel free to bring them up into the chat. Depending on where you're watching, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitch, you can use the chat and type in your questions about Microsoft technologies, about Microsoft products, about Microsoft solutions, about licensing. So feel free to ask your questions here. The new Tech Talk series we started a few weeks ago started with Windows Server 2022 clustering. Maybe you have some questions around this topic. Maybe you remember if you attended this Tech Talk on October 10th, we talked about traditional clusters, the architecture of traditional clusters. We talked about the failover scenario, so how a cluster behaves if a node fails, what happens then? We talked about the majority of votes in a cluster. I explained to you the role of the dynamic quorum and the witness. If you attended this call, maybe you remember that you always have to ensure that you have the majority of the votes in the cluster. Every node has a vote, and the witness, this can be a file share witness, this can be a disk witness, this can be a cloud witness. So the witness also has a vote in such an environment so that we can ensure that in a 2-node cluster or in a 3-node cluster, we can survive several failures. Here in the 3-node cluster, it's interesting. We can see initially the witness has no vote, but if one node fails, then the witness receives a vote based on the dynamic quorum settings. And in the same Tech Talk about clustering, we discussed what's the difference in an HCI cluster. So there we discussed we don't have the full traditional storage stack, but we are working with industry standard servers in a powerful software stack where we use Windows Server 2022 Data Center or Azure Stack HCI to build this hyper-converged infrastructure based on Hyper-V, storage spaces, direct, and software-defined networking. So maybe you have any questions around this Tech Talk about clustering. If yes, feel free to ask here and feel free to ask also your individual questions. I only bring up this previous Tech Talk content as a small summary to maybe give you some thoughts about questions that maybe were not asked in the previous Tech Talk. In our second Tech Talk, we talked about how to install Hyper-V and deploy and configure VMs. Maybe you remember the licensing and editions where I mentioned that Hyper-V is part of every Windows Server edition. So maybe you also have questions about licensing. So licensing is also fine. Please bring up also your licensing questions. To do a short recap here, maybe you remember that Standard and Essentials, these two editions, are identical regarding the technology. So when you install Windows Server 2022 Essentials, you will see a Windows Server 2022 Standard. So it's absolutely identical. But you have a specific licensing contract. The licensing terms in Windows Server 2022 Essentials say you are allowed to run this edition on servers with maximum 10 cores, with maximum 25 users that access the server at a time. And we have included one virtual Windows Server usage right not two like we have it in Windows Server standard, and not unlimited like we have it in data center. So one virtual Windows Server usage right, and Essentials is only available as an OEM license, and we don't need any client access licenses. So the usage rights to access this essential server, they are already included, but we also cannot expand it with client access licenses. Yeah, standard and data center, these are the scalable editions with minimum 16 cores we have to license, and we can license additional cores. Maybe you have any questions about licensing, so feel free to bring up your licensing questions here in the Q&A call. We discussed the licensing where we said, okay, the server has to be licensed with minimum 16 cores, 8 cores per CPU socket, minimum 16 cores in the server. But every core that is available in the server, that is configured in the server, has to be licensed. So if I have a server with 20 cores, for sure I have to license 20 cores. So there we will use the base license with 16 cores and an additional core licensing on top. We have a good question. Essentials, is there any improvement, or is it just the owner who must think about that? This is the tricky thing here. In all the licensing stuff, we don't have any licensing servers or proofs we have to bring on the technical side. So it's exactly as you ask here, it's the owner that has to think about this. So the owner sees, oh, I have a Windows Server standard because this is what we see in the system information. And I have to keep in mind, but I have bought the essential license where I have different licensing terms. So there will be no technical alert if I'm running essentials on a machine with 12 cores. There's no technical alert if I'm accessing with 100 users. There's no technical alert if I'm running more than one virtual Windows server. But all the things I mentioned are violation of the licensing terms, so we should not do this. But very good question. It's only licensing based, this regulatory. There's no technical instance that checks if I'm using Windows Server Essentials accordingly to the licensing terms, because Essentials, it's only another label on the installation kit, on the installation media. There shouldn't be a violation usually, because the Windows Server Essentials is an OEM product. So there shouldn't be a violation regarding the cores, because Essentials is an OEM product that is sold together with the hardware. But for sure, it could happen that the customer accesses the Essential server with more users, or maybe a customer runs more virtual machines. What is happening if we have high availability cluster, 3 hosts, each has 16 cores, how many should be licensed? So when we are building a cluster, every node has to be licensed individually based on the licensing terms. So let's have a look at the 2-node cluster. We can see here, for example, in this 2-node cluster configuration, this is an HCI cluster, or here we have a traditional cluster. Let's imagine each host has 16 cores. Then we have to license 16 cores Windows Server 2022 on each node. So now the question is, do we need standard or data center? In the HCI scenario, where we use storage spaces direct, we will need the data center edition of Windows Server, or we have to choose Azure Stack HCI OS. I will show you the next TechTalk Monday calls, and on some of the next calls, we will talk in detail about Azure Stack HCI also. But when we think about Windows Server, we will need for HCI the Data Center Edition. In the scenario where we have a traditional cluster, this is also possible with standard, but where we have to take care, when we have an outage of one node, we have a failover of the virtual machines to the other host. So we have to ensure that we have licensed 6 virtual usage rights on the left-hand side. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this means that I have to license all the 16 cores. This server here has 16 cores. 3 times for Windows Server 2022 standard to have this usage rights. So I will need 48 cores on the left-hand side and 48 cores on the right-hand side to have this cluster correctly licensed. So this means we need here 48 cores standard plus 48 cores on the right hand side. So overall 96 cores. If we are using data center in this scenario, let's switch to the purple color here. Or we are using 16 cores data center plus 16 cores data center. So data center also on both sides. So in a cluster, all the nodes have to be licensed. And in a traditional cluster, we can use the standard edition. And this means that we can, in smaller scenarios, reduce the costs in a cluster configuration, but we have to ensure that we have the required amount for every failover scenario. So in your 3-node configuration, we also have to license all the 3 nodes. When my host has more cores, let's imagine this host here has 20 cores, then we have a different situation. Let's do it like this. Now we have 20 cores in this host. And we have 20 physical cores here. Then this means we need 60 cores. Standard plus 60 cores standard on the right-hand side. Or we need, let's take the blue one, or we need 20 cores data center plus 20 cores data center. The reason why 60 cores standard is that the standard licensing, when the host is licensed correctly, includes 2 virtual usage rights. So if I need 6 virtual Windows Server usage rights, I have to license the host 3 times. In my scenario, the host has 20 cores. And so I have to license 60 cores standard to have 6 virtual usage rights. This is still cheaper than the data center edition. The break even is usually when you have 10 virtual machines in the cluster. But for sure, the break even is earlier there if you have a 3-node or 4-node or 5-node cluster, because as you can see here in the picture, that every node has to be licensed. because in a cluster, thanks for the feedback, in a cluster, we don't have this manual failover. So in a Hyper-V replica scenario, you could decide to only license the production machine and have a failover machine where you initiate a failover manually. And then depending on the specific scenario, maybe we don't need licenses for our virtual machines. But the advantage of a cluster is usually that the failover occurs automatically, and the cluster also can move virtual machines when there is no outage, only to optimize the workload. And this is the reason why I prefer in cluster scenarios the data center edition, because then I don't have to calculate and always look if the machine number or the number of virtual machines is correctly licensed. But from the technical perspective, in a traditional cluster, it's not required to have the data center. It's also possible to use standard and to stack standard licenses. And maybe you are not running virtual machines. Maybe you have a cluster where you are running a SQL Server workload. And in this scenario, for sure, standard is the perfect edition, because the standard edition ensures that you have the full scalability, you have the cluster feature, and your workload is in this SQL Server scenario, not VMs, but SQL Server. There's an important topic for the SQL Server in the cluster. Let's imagine, let's go back to the running workload. Let's imagine we have a SQL Server in a VM. Let's imagine the SQL Server is running here. This machine is our SQL machine. It's Microsoft SQL Server running. Then the important thing is to know that for server applications, we have a benefit that's called license mobility, not for the server OS itself. So please never make the mistake that you try to transfer licensing knowledge from one product to another product in the Microsoft ecosystem. So we have the licensing for Office. The Office licensing is completely different from the Windows Client OS. And this is completely different from the Windows Server OS. And this is completely different from the Windows Server applications like SQL Server or Exchange. So to give you an example, when you're using the OEM license, you have in Windows Server 2022 in the OEM license, so the direct OEM or the reseller option kit or the channel OEM license from Microsoft. So all OEM licenses have identical usage rights. So if you are using the OEM license of Windows Server, you have an unlimited downgrade right to every supported Windows Server version. So when we buy Windows Server 2022 OEM license, we can downgrade to 2019, to 2016, to 2012 R2, to 2012. In Windows Client, when we use the OEM product, we have a downgrade right to the previous two versions. It's versions, it's not editions, it's versions. And when we use Office as an OEM product, we don't have any downgrade right. And in this small example, we are talking about downgrade. Maybe you want to use things like remote desktop services scenarios. We discussed this yesterday. Or maybe you have things like virtualization and so on. It's completely different in each product category and sometimes even in each product. So now let's go back to the SQL scenario. For server applications, we have the situation when we add on software assurance, then the software assurance adds the license mobility to the server application. There's no license mobility for Windows Server. I'm asked so often, oh, Manfred, when I'm licensing Windows Server on a volume license with software assurance, I have this software license mobility stuff, right? No, there is no license mobility for Windows Server in this scenario. There's a thing that is called, unfortunately, license mobility for Windows Server when it comes to use the license in hosting scenarios. But for me, this is not a license mobility. This is a hybrid use right or an usage option for cloud workloads. Here for SQL Server, the license mobility means that in the license terms of SQL Server, they say, okay, when I install SQL Server on this machine here, so this server number 4, for example, this is server 4, then the SQL Server is licensed for this server 4. And this server 4 is running on this physical hardware here. So this SQL Server is licensed for server 4 on this physical hardware. This means I cannot move this server, the SQL Server, whenever I want to another host. The software assurance adds the license benefit that I can move the virtual machine, the virtual SQL Server whenever I want to another host, and I can move the machine back, and I can even move the SQL Server license to another virtual machine here because I have the license mobility. For sure, the movement from virtual server 4 to 5 is more difficult because I need a SQL Server installation on server 5 first. But especially the movement of this virtual machine number 4 to the other host, for example, via live migration. This is a typical daily action that can happen. There, it's important to have the software assurance for the server application for things like SQL Server, Exchange Server. For Windows Server, we have a lot of benefits based on the software assurance, but not for cluster scenarios. In a cluster scenario, when we have a failover to another host, we never move Windows Server licenses. We always move bits and bytes and start the machines again. And this is the reason why we have to ensure that all the hosts are completely licensed to ensure that we are allowed to run this workload every time. For the applications, we have the license mobility thing through the software assurance. Yeah, so perfect for your questions. Perfect for the essentials question because this is important. This is a little bit tricky because it's really only in the licensing terms. And thank you for the cluster question. Feel free to send in more of these questions. Every question around the Microsoft ecosystem is allowed. Maybe to add something about the essentials question or the essentials product itself. I often receive questions based on this topic that essentials from the technical perspective is standard. So what happens if I'm downgrading to a previous Windows Server version? This is a little bit tricky to understand because when I buy Windows Server 2022 Essentials, for sure, regarding the licensing terms, I'm allowed to downgrade to Windows Server 2019 Essentials or Windows Server 2016 Essentials. But what I have to know, these previous versions, 2019 and 2016 Essentials, were individual editions. So in these previous versions of Windows Server, we hadn't the identical bits and bytes for standard and essentials. So I mentioned in Windows Server 2022, the difference between standard and essentials are only the licensing terms, not the bits and bytes. So you will, if you test this, you will see when you go to the system information, you have installed Windows Server Essentials, you can read standard. Even in the setup progress itself, you will read standard. In the previous versions, these were different bits and bytes. In Windows Server 2019, they were comparable to 2019, but it was an individual edition. in 2016, Essentials 2016, Essentials had an own surface. There we had own wizards for deployment and configuration tools. And so if you downgrade from Essentials 2022 to 2019 or 2016 Essentials, you will miss many features you have in the 2022 Essentials, because the previous versions of Essentials, for example, didn't have the data deduplication, they didn't have the storage migration service and so on, because these were smaller editions, also based on the bits and bytes, also based on the technology here. This is important to know and to keep in mind. And what's also important to know about the Essentials product, you are not allowed to license 2022 Essentials and install a previous version standard, because the licensing terms, they say Essentials. And so it's not a downgrade path to previous version standard possible. If you want to downgrade to a previous version of Windows Server Standard, you have to license Windows Server 2022 Standard. Then you can use the previous standard version here. Hopefully this is clear so far. Okay, any additional questions about clustering, about Essentials, about licensing? Oh, now we have a question where I have to check this. Microsoft has begun rolling out Windows 11 2020 H2 upgrade. There are different versions, 2026-1, 2026-2, 2026-3, which is distributed via standard Windows update. So I'm not absolutely sure about this. I have to check this or find this out. But what we can do, I have an update run on my system here. Actually, I'm using here. And let's have a look at this machine here. Here, this is exactly the machine where I'm working on. And here we can see this update was installed today in the morning. And it's OS build 22621.674. So this update was run based on the standard Windows update process. And let's check another machine. Let's use, this is a virtual machine I installed in a blank installation on a virtual machine. And let's check this out. This is, I would assume this is the same version I had on my host. It's the OS build 226.1674. Yes, this is the same OS build. It's the same feature experience pack. So this is identical. So for your information, Helmut, and your question, both systems were installed in different ways. The first screen we have seen was an update based on the classic update progress in the Windows update settings. The second machine we are actually looking on was an installation based on the ISO image I can download from Microsoft. So this is a download from the Windows 11 download web page or portal. And so this was in a virtual machine. Yeah, both machines are freshly installed. I assume these different versions you are mentioning, they are based on maybe the update packages that are already available but I have to check this. We only have the proof of my two systems I have here. So then additional question, what are the advantages of 22H2 and what about known about problems with certain printer drivers which maybe block upgrading? There's a web page for known issues with Windows 11 2020 H2, and this is the known issues page here. I will post this known issues with Windows 11 2020 H2. This is the page here. And I will send the link, and I'm not sure if this works as a link. And when you go to this page, you will see we have a few issues that are known and where we already have solutions. For example, there's a specific sound driver for some sound or audio cards that has to be upgraded. If we have this audio card in our system, then the upgrade is blocked because if we will not upgrade the driver, this would result in a blue screen. So this is already known. And Helmut, you mentioned the printer drivers. And the printer drivers, here we have the situation that we have known issues that some printers lose their capabilities. So we can still print, but they don't know that they can print color or duplex or things like this. There's actually no upgrade from Microsoft, but the workaround is to uninstall the printer driver and reinstall it after the upgrade to 2020 H2, so to Windows 11 2020 H2 version. It's not required in all the scenarios I know to install any new version of a printer driver or to use a different driver. The issue is solved in installing the driver again after upgrading here. So this is the URL. If you are live in the stream, you have the URL in the chat. And Helmut writes, link works, thank you. So here, this is also your page if you see any issues with, or no, this is your page if you upgrade to maybe also in the future 23H2 or something like this, and you want to inform before you upgrade to this client OS version, before you run into such problems. So here you can see this page is also available for Windows 11 21 H2, and this is also available for Windows 10. This is available for Windows Server. So when you go to Windows Server 2022, known issues, we also have this known issue list here. It's also not a ultra long list, but we have some issues that are already known. Some of them are all known from the Windows client. And we have the same thing for Windows 11 21 H2, the known issues. And we have the resolved issues for the system. So it's the same URL and you can switch between the products. The other part was, what are the advantages of 22H2? It's regarding the client OS. So in the Windows Client OS, we have a lot of advantages regarding the handling. So when you think about things like the start menu, now in the start menu, you can build folders. It was not possible in the previous version. So you can use applications and bring them together, and you could say, okay, Messenger and WhatsApp, this is one thing, and the TikTok maybe is something here in streaming, and you can name these folders, and you can say, okay, this is messaging. So this is one of the new things in the start menu. There are many new settings options in the start menu. So many things are regarding handling easier in the 2020 H2 version. Also, the screen snapping is now better, because now we have new layouts we can use to place our windows. We could build something like this here, for example, and then here use the Windows security in the second screen. Let's take this one here to the second one in the middle, and on the right hand side another application and things like this. This could be configured here. And regarding the security, we have two new things. We have several new things. We have an enhanced phishing filter that now recognizes if you try to use passwords on different identical passwords on different websites. We have an enhanced phishing filter that realizes if you are using an application that communicates in the back end with a known phishing target. We have in this enhanced phishing filter the option that the filter realizes if you use copy and paste for passwords, and when you copy passwords to unsecure applications. And we have a technology, I have this opened here in the security center, that is called Smart App Control. Maybe you know the security center in Windows. It's very, very powerful. It's also available in Windows Server, the security center. And with the app and browser control, sorry, it's in German language, this machine here, I will not switch it to English. We have the smart app control. And in the smart app control, we have activated, deactivated, and investigating here in the middle. When smart app control is activated, we are using an KI intelligence in Azure to ensure that on this machine, we only have running applications that are well known, that are not known as malware or malicious programs or phishing applications. So, and I don't have to configure anything. I only have to activate this, but the Smart App Control is only available on new installed Windows 11 2020 H2 devices. And the Smart App Control is deactivated if we are using Defender Application Guard, because Defender Application Guard is the company managed feature, and the Smart App Control is the cloud delivered by Microsoft KI managed feature. But it's an interesting thing. So security is enhanced in 2020 H2. Security is always one of the focus topics in the new versions of Windows Server or Windows Client. And we have the situation that we have the optimized handling. So I found many new things like the start menu, like the settings app, for example, that is extended, where I'm seeing many benefits in the 2020 H2 version. So Helmut, feel free to add questions if you have some specific things you want to ask about. This was only in a few minutes my highlights about the Windows 11 2020 H2 version. Yeah, great, such questions. Feel free to send in more of these questions. Yesterday in the Tech Talk, we talked about the remote desktop services. And in the remote desktop services, we spent some time to discuss the compatibility of the Office applications and the Windows Server versions. Feel free to ask any question you are interested in about the Microsoft ecosystem. So you have seen also Windows Client. Feel free to ask. I will spend some time to talk again about this table, because what's important for me, and I'm realizing very often that this is not clear to everybody, out here in the market is that to run a Microsoft system configuration, we need several things. For sure, we need, typically when it's on premises, the hardware, and we need the software, and we have to use the software according the licensing terms. It's important to understand that not everything that's possible is allowed based on the licensing terms. So, for example, we discussed about Windows Server 2022 Essentials. I could take this Essentials edition and install it from the technical perspective on a machine with 32 cores. This will work. But I'm not correctly licensed then. And if my licensing is already wrong, then I never can have a supported system configuration. And for sure, when I violate the licensing terms, I can run into real trouble if I have a licensing audit. So I should never do this. I was often asked about this. Manfred, what happens if I'm running Essentials with more than 10 cores? What's happening if I have more than one virtual machine? What is happening if I have a standard 16 core license and I'm adding cores without licensing them? These are all things you shouldn't test, because why is this interesting? What happens? You are not allowed to do it regarding the licensing terms. And so it's important to have a scenario we can use in production environment. We first have to clarify the licensing thing. Unfortunately, sometimes it's very complex to have a solution for the licensing requirement we have. But here you can use the TechTalk Q&A and bring your question up, and I will try to answer your question. So first important thing is licensing. The second important question is, will the configuration I'm planning, will this configuration work? Yeah, we can test this. We can do a proof of concept. We can do a test installation. But before we do this, it's important to clarify, is this possible regarding the licensing terms? So do we have the required licenses, or is it possible to have this scenario licensed? So scenario I'm often see in the field is that customers are using Windows 11 clients as a terminal server. There are third-party solutions in the market that enable multi-user remote access on Windows 11. This is not possible based on the licensing terms. There is no licensing option to activate multi-remote desktop user access on a Windows client on premises. Not if the client is a physical machine, not if the client is a virtual machine. So every Windows client has the usage rights for one console session. So I'm sitting in front of the client and I'm using keyboard, mouse, and the screen, or the surface I'm using. So the surface of the screen is the meaning of my words, or I'm accessing this machine remote via remote desktop or another technology. All the third-party solutions in the market that enable multi-usage on Windows Client OS violate the Microsoft licensing terms, and so nobody should buy them, because my first check, is there a way to license this scenario, cannot be answered with an yes. It's always no, it's not possible. Yeah. Okay, so licensing first, then I have to check it technical. Is it technical possible? And the third thing is, this is the question that's important if you are responsible for the solution, is this configuration supported by Microsoft? Does Microsoft say, yes, you can do this? And this is important, especially for this thing here. We discussed this yesterday. Maybe you attended the Tech Talk about the remote desktop services in Windows Server. Windows Server 2022, in combination with Windows Server, in combination with Microsoft 365 apps, we have the situation that the licensing terms are fine. Licensing terms allow us to use Microsoft 365 apps on Windows Server 2022. From the technical perspective, it's possible. It works. But the problem is regarding the support. It's not supported today. This means from the three things I have to check, is it the way to have it licensed accordingly? Yes, green check mark. Does it work? Yes, if you try it out, you will realize I can install Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise on Windows Server 2022. Is it supported? No, not today. Today, the support is in preview. If you attended the Tech Talk call yesterday, you also have seen this. The support is actually in preview. This is the announcement about this. But here is also important to read correctly, because the support, the official support, will be added later, at a later date, maybe this year, maybe later in the future. So this sentence here is really nothing. Windows Server 2022 is currently, the support for running Microsoft 365 apps on Windows Server 2022 is currently in preview. This is like the announcement Azure Virtual Desktop on premises is actually in preview, or Windows Server vNext is in preview. Windows Server vNext, the next version of Windows Server, so the next version after Windows Server 2022 is in preview. You can download this, you can test this, but this does not mean that this version is supported. The next version of Windows Server is supported when this next version is released. Usually the release life cycle of Windows Server is a new version every 2 to 3 years. So I expect a new version of Windows Server in 2025, somewhere then. Till this time, we have the situation that Windows Server Next is in preview. Yes, we know this, but this does not mean it's supported. And this announcement here also says, Office will be supported out of the Microsoft 365 apps for enterprise at a later point of time in Windows Server. So today, no support available here. In the future, maybe later in 2022 or later in 2023, there we will have a support for this combination till October 2026. It's not till the end of support of Windows Server, but till October 2026. But this is later, so always read these announcements from Microsoft correctly or understand them correctly. Okay, let's talk a little bit. Okay, Helmut has a question. Microsoft has their own remote desktop help app to provide online support. Would you use it to provide support to clients? How secure is it? Security is not the issue here, because we have detailed security baselines and explanations. This is all secure and then encrypted, so I wouldn't see any issues there. But the remote support application, I think it needs some training for the customer. So you have to explain how it works. If the customer knows about it, I wouldn't see any issue regarding the security stuff or usage of this application. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the next Tech Talks. Next Monday on 11:30 German time, we have today we also started at 11:30 German time. We have a Tech Talk, how to install and configure Active Directory domain services and DNS on Windows Server 2022. And I'm looking forward to have you in this Tech Talk call. On November the 7th, we have Azure Stack HCI version 2020 H2. This is a new Azure Stack HCI version 2020 H2. We also have this version naming in the Windows Client OS, but here we are talking about the Azure Stack HCI OS. And I'm looking forward to have you in this Tech Talk. On November the 14th, we have Azure Arc Administration and Services Overview. Azure Arc is a real powerful technology. Then on the 15th November, we have the next Tech Talk Q&A. So in every content Tech Talk, you can ask your questions about the topic we are talking about. In the Tech Talk like we have it today, you can ask every question out of the Microsoft ecosystem. Today we had questions about Windows Client, about essentials, about clustering. On November 21st, we are talking about Windows Admin Center update. On November the 28th, we are talking about Azure Kubernetes services on Azure Stack HCI. On November the 29th, we are talking, or we have our next Microsoft Tech Talk for your questions. In December, we are talking about the Azure Stack HCI resiliency, so things like cache and drives, cluster, stretch cluster, Azure Backup, Azure Site Recovery. Then on December the 12th, we are talking about Azure Stack HCI networking settings, segmentation, load balancers, firewall, and things like this. Also in December, we have a Tech Talk Q&A for your questions. In December the 19th, we are talking about Azure Stack HCI security, secured core, and things like this. And then we are at the end of the year, and hopefully we will see us for the next Tech Talks then in calendar year 2023. So hopefully you will find time to join the Tech Talks on Monday, the Tech Talk Q&A on Tuesday. And so we have 5 minutes left. If you have any more questions around the Microsoft solutions and technologies, and feel free to bring them up in the chat. I'm looking forward to have you here on Monday in the Tech Talk about how to install and configure Active Directory domain services. We will see a lot of live demos there. So it will be a demo-driven session where the focus is on building an Azure Active Directory, not an Azure Active Directory. Sorry, I said Azure Active Directory, an Active Directory domain services on premises based on Windows Server 2022. So far, thank you for your time. Thank you for your questions. Use the remaining time for some additional questions. Maybe I can add something regarding the licensing questions we had, because we had the questions about the editions and the question, is there any license server where we enter the things? For sure, when we want to access Windows Server 2022, or if we want to use services provided by a Windows Server 2022, then we need Windows Server 2022 client access licenses. A newer client access license version also allows us to access previous Windows Server versions, but an older client access license version does not allow us to access later Windows Server versions. It's also it's important to have the latest version of the client access licenses. The client access license for Windows Server is not entered anywhere in the Windows Server operating system. So there's no Windows Server client access license licensing server or something like this. But for sure, you need these client access licenses. They are required regarding the licensing perspective. And I think we discussed this very intensively today. And I think it was understandable to you how important it is to have a correctly licensed environment. The remote desktop services CAL we need on top to the Windows Server Client Access License. This client access license, the RDS CAL, this license has to be activated in the RDS licensing server. So for Windows Server CALs, no server where we have to enter them. They are only required on the piece of paper where we buy them. The remote desktop services CAL has to be activated in the RDS licensing server within 120 days after installation. And the Windows Server Client Access License is not needed for the infrastructure parts like for virtualization infrastructure. So a Hyper-V host, for the Hyper-V host, we don't need a client access license. For the workload inside the VMs, we need this. This is important, this knowledge, because maybe you are running Hyper-V on the latest version. Maybe you are using Windows Server 2022 data center on your Hyper-V host. You're using Hyper-V and maybe storage space is direct. But all your virtual machines are Windows Server 2019 or previous versions. Then it's fine to use the Windows Server 2019 client access licenses because the Hyper-V host or the HCI host we are using does not require client access licenses. Maybe this as an addition to this topic here. Okay, so far from my side, I don't see any additional questions in the chat. So thank you for your time today. Thank you for your questions. And I'm looking forward to see you on Monday for the Tech Talk about how to install and configure Active Directory domain services in DNS. Have a good time. See you next week, Monday. Have a nice day. Bye.